And also thank you for a wonderful conference. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks to you and your committee for giving me this opportunity. So my job today is to provide the moderation. And I take that to mean it's basically a traffic cop role. So what I'll do is make probably about a minute or two of remarks, and then I'll hand it off to Christian, and then on to Scott. And then after that, we're going to open it up for questions, right? So the reason being that the best way to pull it together is for you all to ask questions about the things that you want to talk about. So that's where we're headed. My takeaways on this conference are, first of all, it's focused on young people, right? The key issue with any set of ideas is that they be passed on to the next generation of scholars who then can take them and form research agendas and provide the research that actually drills down into the questions that are raised. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this session is how you think about setting research agendas individually. So when I look back over the last couple days, last day or so, I start with Hester Pierce. And she asked for me, I think, what is a critical question, that, you know, we think about regulatory processes and we recognize that everybody except ourselves brings a lot of baggage on that. We're the only objective person in the room. I know that's true for me. We also know that regulatory processes are biased towards more. They rarely ask questions like, can we do with less? Or are there things that we're doing that are inefficient that we ought to rethink, and there may be better ways to do it? And so I think there's a set of issues associated with that. And can we ever have enough? Right? So if I look back, I've done a fair amount of historical work, and so when I think about these questions, I think about them starting like in 1934. And when I think about that, I see lots of stuff ladled on the top of it, and you have a big pile. And the question is that pile the optimal one, or even close to the optimal one? And I don't know the answers to that question. The corollary to Pierce's remarks, I think, is to stay skeptical. And what I mean by that is stay objective. When people are talking about what they want to do in regulatory terms, it's good to question them. It's good to question them hard. It's not good to be adversarial, but people have to be questioned, and we have to avoid things like what Friedrich Hayek would call scientism, or Richard Feynman would have called cargo cult science. We have things that look like science, but it's not really science, because quantification allows us some comfort that things are actually more scientific and systematic than we're portraying them. And that goes back to the objectivity question that we have. Do we really know what we think we know? Another message I think that came out of this is to stay away from intellectual corner solutions. So I've always found it very interesting that in the first 2 weeks of an economics course, we learned that interior solutions are likely to be preferable to corner solutions. And then when we listen to economics people talk to us, it's that it's all economics. There's nothing that can be learned from anything else, right? And it doesn't work that way. So I think when I look at think about Mark Peacher's comments and the editors and the dean's comments, the idea that people approaching the same kinds of issues with different perspectives is not a problem, it's a healthy thing. And the big takeaway for me was the Kaplan session. Anchor your research agendas in enduring and important questions. Right? You can think of those as managerially relevant or policy relevant or other scholar relevant, but somebody somewhere has to think that what you're doing is important and interesting. And I think that's the big message here. The thing that I've really liked about this conference is that the discussion has been on how you think about setting up research questions and research agendas. Okay, there's 3 issues I think we'll talk about, our speakers will talk about today. One is, what are the obstacles to gathering evidence on the effects of regulation? The second is, how is evidence-based regulation different than gathering evidence on the effects of regulation? Because I do think that there are subtle differences between the two. And the question with evidence-based regulation is, how do you use it intelligently and not let it devolve into social engineering 101, which ends up with all kinds of unintended consequences that nobody thought about. And then finally, the question is, where do we go from here? What do we do? Because there's been a lot of stuff out on the table over the course of the last day, and we want to figure out what to do with it. So Christian and then Scott will talk, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks again for putting me on this panel. I think the discussions over the last day and a half have been super interesting, and I certainly have learned a lot. And so I'll try to do something similar to Greg, which is to sort of reflect a little bit on some themes we've heard and pull this in with the questions that Greg was posing. So reflecting on the themes, I would say there were a couple themes that were pretty obvious. One was the theme of causal identification and what some of the issues are, and we hit that. So I'm, unless you want to talk some more about it, I'm going to sort of move on. But where I want to connect it with is Rob was making the point that he thinks the SEC should play a role in generating data. And I do want to say that and this came up in the audit panel also nicely, I think our data often are way too coarse to answer some of the questions that we want to answer. And so for that, I think the regulators, standard setters, firms, and issuers could play a very important role in opening this up. So the example that came up in the auditing panel, which I think was excellent, is chasing audit quality with discretionary accruals. Is sort of an example that shows how coarse some of our data is. And the third theme that probably was the loudest and clearest, aside from the one that Greg already mentioned, which is sort of the relevance of work and impact of our work. The third one that I want to mention is the intermediation and transmission of our findings. And here I feel like both in the relevance debate when it comes to now specifically regulation, as well as in the transmission, I think we have a decision to make. And so and by we, I mean actually we as regulators, standard setters, and academics jointly, because I think we're in this together. If we would like to have sort of a more evidence-informed approach, like Rob was, for instance, strongly pushing for, then I think we need to be much more deliberate about this in how we're going about this. So let me talk about our part, and then maybe in the Q&A, or Scott, who was obviously seen it from the inside, can talk more about the regulator's perspective and what are some of the obstacles that Greg was asking about. But in my mind, it's what Laureen said yesterday, is I think we have to walk the talk, and otherwise we're paying lip service to this. And so what I mean by being deliberate about it is I think if this is where we want to go, and I think it's the question, that's the decision, then we need to build an infrastructure that takes that produces the research, but then also is deliberate about how we aggregate the findings and what we've learned, that stress tests it and thinks about the reliability of research, and then takes it and helps channeling it to the relevant decision makers and policy. And I've yesterday used the example of evidence-based medicine, and in the article that Peter was referring to, I've sort of chronicled this a little bit. That wasn't an effort that sort of came about overnight and by accident. It actually started with a couple people around David Sackett at McMaster's University in Canada. And they were very deliberate in their efforts in setting this up. They realized that it had a lot to do with methodology. They were very deliberate in linking this to tighter research methods, RCTs, but also how do we think about the reliability of our research? How can we aggregate it? They had conferences around this, like this one. This is why I loved that Peter et al. Were sort of putting this on. I give you sort of one concrete example, because I think evidence-based medicine, in the end, we're not medicine. And I think I've used this sort of more as an aspirational goal and to see, to learn from another field that has gone through this. But I want to give you two examples on transmissions. There are some clearinghouses for research that we could be setting up. And this is something that I think Scott can talk some more about, but they, for instance, exist in labor. There's one that's called CLEAR, and it stands for something like clearinghouse for labor research, and I'm not getting the acronym exactly right, but it's basically trying to do this aggregation of research, and there is a couple others that I was able to find. But there's another great example from the medical field, and that is what they call Cochrane Reviews. And I don't know how many of you in the room have heard about these Cochrane Reviews, but they're basically systematic reviews that are very different from the kind of reviews, the literature reviews that many of us have done. They're comprehensive in the way they're trying to review the primary research and the way they're trying to summarize the best available evidence. They're often very much driven by a specific question. The questions are often, in this case, medical interventions. What do you do in this particular instance, or how should a patient be treated with these kind of conditions? But there's also ones on policy questions, smoking cessation, and various other themes that are more policy rather than specific medical interventions. But again, to show how systematic they were in going about this, they have a manual that's like it's like 200 and something pages long, where they have thought about how do we actually summarize our research and put these reviews together. And they include often meta-analyses. Again, and that's where it matters that they, for instance, have RCTs. They might include some statistical analyses. They provide conclusions, and here, importantly, the conclusions are divided into implications for practice, implications for research, and there is a plain English version that would then help if you're sort of not an expert in the field. And connected to something that Robert Necko was saying yesterday, typically putting them together involves an army of people. So this is a collaborative effort of many people, not just like one or two writing a survey. If you've ever written a survey, it's a massive drain on your time. But they're literally trying to sort of coalesce a huge team of people and to kind of put this together. And again, they apply the manual and the guidelines they've provided. And there you see that they're also, similar like we discussed, are trading off things like external and internal validity, and they have sort of specific, even sometimes hierarchies for what research they will put more emphasis on, less emphasis on, and how it was generated. And so that's what was one reason why earlier I was saying I disagree a little bit with that dichotomy. So let me stop here and turn it over to Scott.
Thanks once again to the CARE conference organizers for putting this together. I found the day and a half to be extremely educational and also self-servingly directly related to what I plan to do next, so it's given a lot of ideas for myself. And I just wanted to open with a thought that occurred to me just this morning on why this audience is so relevant for discussion from a policy perspective. When I arrived in government in 2007, it was a small, sleepy shop at the SEC, and not all economists had PhDs, and I use the word economist to include accountants and other social sciences, but we just happened to practice economics at the SEC. But many were undergraduates, maybe graduate students, master's degree. They were very smart. But there was a very big difference between somebody who had a PhD and didn't. And it had to do with performing and successfully defending a dissertation, demonstrated a skill that would put you at the frontier of knowledge, and demonstrated a persistence in problem solving that were two things that were necessary to enact a good policy. And I was there for over a decade, and that was just a very distinguishing mark on those who were able to do relevant things for policy that nobody else could do. But it's a voice that often people do not want to hear, precisely because it is so good. And so I think Rob talked a little bit about this, but there are people that have views, they're normative views, and they don't want anybody to tell them differently. They don't need evidence, they just want to do it. And so that was, Peter's reference to some of my frustration I had at the commission was, how do you actually make change and get people to make good decisions, even if they privilege different elements of a decision differently? So I knew last year about this time that I was probably going to leave. And by the summertime, I knew I was going to leave. And in September, I was trying to figure out, well, what the heck am I going to do when I go? It occurred to me very early on that if I could do the job I was doing at the SEC, but on the outside, that's what I'd want to do. And so during the fall last year, while I was still at the SEC, and with the approval of the Ethics Council at the SEC, I was engaging in outside conversations with people like Christian and others in this room to figure out, is it possible to do my job, just not at the SEC? And I talked to think tanks like Brookings and AEI. I talked to individuals that set up 501c3s as independent platforms. And I also talked to a few universities. And about halfway through the fall, after about a dozen or two dozen conversations, I started aggregating these ideas into a white paper that some of you have read and actually commented on or contributed to try to materialize or try to make this happen. And the hardest thing I had to do was to answer the questions, particularly when I talked to an ex-government official, senior ex-government official, or former commissioners or chairman about my vision is exactly that. Well, what is your vision? And coming up with a vision and mission statement was extremely difficult. To simplify it, and this is what I came up with, and this is what I'm going to try to do, and what the University of Texas has kindly agreed to support, is to increase the relevance of academic research in the decision sciences in 3 areas: the design, implementation, and evaluation of security markets regulation, or what they've now called financial market regulation. So that is the vision. That's what I'd like to do. It's very circular. You design, you implement, and you evaluate, and then you design again based on those evaluations. The mission. So what am I actually going to try to do when I go to Texas? Is to create an infrastructure and incentive for academic researchers to participate in the policy process. And so what does that mean? I came up with 5 things that I don't know exactly how I'm going to do yet. I'm still soliciting feedback and input from others. And it falls something along the lines of, 1, providing educational and operational resources to academics. It is true that most of you probably are experts in areas and often have no idea that your policy area or your area, there's an active policy issue. So notifying academics, finding a way that people know that their areas are active and relevant is step number 1. Step number 2 is providing resources to let you know how to engage. So you know somebody's talking about your area, but what do? Rob said he would write a comment letter and he didn't know if anybody would listen. And the SEC does listen, other regulators do listen. I know the process, I understand it, I know how to write a comment letter to get that attention. And so trying to provide those resources to academics. If you're willing to write a referee report for a paper, are you willing to write a comment letter? And if so, let me help you do it in a way that can be effective. The second is try to find ways to do academic-oriented post-implementation reviews. And this, I think, dovetails nicely into what Christian was saying about Cochrane Reviews. What I noticed at the SEC, the comment and question I asked earlier today, or the editors panel, about when you try to assemble a lot of evidence and you can't get it all to work together very well, well, how do you solve that problem? I really like the idea of academic letters or some sort of short form way to update previous studies to provide comment on whether they're still relevant. Things of that nature. What can you do? Where can you find money to support that? And who would be the right person to do it? It may not be you. It may be somebody else directed by you doing those studies. Now, the third area is promote research ideas from open regulatory issues. If you're an economist or an accountant at the SEC, it's probably true that ideas come to you faster than you can execute on because you're talking to market participants every day. It's like playing the game of Jeopardy where somebody gives you the answer and you're like, you do that? I wonder why. What is the research question that would explain this very strange behavior I just heard about? And if you read a rule, and I wouldn't advise you to do that because it could be 1,000 pages and they're very dense, but in that rule, there are probably 15 research ideas, and if I were a PhD student or advising one today, I would say go back to the rules that were written in 2012 and read all the questions they asked the market about why they should be doing this regulation, and you're probably going to find a research idea in that area that now there's data available because it's been 5 years post-implementation to answer that question. Is there a way to systematically pull that information out, provide that to the academic community to make it easier and more accessible for those research ideas to be implemented? The fourth area, and I think this is really critical is in designing and disseminating policy impact factors. I do know that the motivation for many academics to engage is limited because the reward system, particularly at certain universities, may not exist. I think a lot of that has to do with measurement. If there are ways to measure the impact of what all you're doing on regulation or policy exists, then I think that would encourage more of it. And the last area that I'd like to try to work on is intermediating conversations between academics and congressional staff and regulatory staff on issues. A mosaic of literature may exist that doesn't directly impact a policy issue, but somebody who understands that literature can assimilate that and translate it into normative views that could be very impactful and helpful to a regulator or congressional staff. Sitting down with a congressional staff member or regulatory officer and explaining to them how all the things work together and unintended consequences can have a profound impact. 5 minutes with the right person could have very significant impacts on the direction of potential rule or regulation. And again, I would suspect that most of you in this room probably wouldn't know how to have that conversation, and I'd like to figure out ways to facilitate those types of dialogues. And so, as I said at the beginning, these are things that I would like to do. I don't have all the answers. I don't know whether they'll be successful, but I'm very much interested in knowing from the academic community which of those activities resonates, or ideas for why they would work, or in fact, why they would not work.
Well, I think we can open up for questions and then we can still chime in.
Okay, let's go. Bjorn.
Hi. So the basis for our discussion has been over the past day and a half that if we provide higher quality information to standard setters, they will make better decisions. That is true in a single person decision setting. But if you think of a world where the SEC only regulates part of the securities that are publicly listed, but doesn't regulate, say, the European Union, then we know from game theory that sometimes having less information can give you a strategic advantage in international negotiations and standard setting, right? Now, I am with the presumed assumption that we have all maintained that more information is better in our setting, but it is actually not always true, and we want to have that slight caveat. And so the second thing is, we don't have many randomized experiments in neither standard setting or in accounting research. But there is one, which is Reg Show, that most of you know, right? And that the SEC engaged in, but after it found no effect from its random experiment, it meant that years later it limited the strategic options for what SEC could regulate, because you can't do undue regulation. And in terms of research, I just want to name and shame Jeremy Michaels, because he actually has a random experiment that builds on the Christensen, Highland, Lloyd's paper. Is that right? In a sense, using the different fiscal year end and then having the random event be earthquakes or hurricanes or stuff like that, right? And so I guess my question is, can we really be sure that random experiments with a better and more precise answer actually is better for those entities that the SEC needs to regulate? And secondly, in terms of who should the SEC take care of in its social welfare function? Is it only the US investors, or is it investors around the world? Because those are different objective functions, right? Thank you.
So I think Scott will have something to say about the randomized experiments, which is pretty interesting. So I'll let him handle that. Let me just make one comment with respect to the start of your comment, which I think is a very important one. In that, I think this gets to Greg's, I think, obstacles to some of the evidence-informed approaches to regulation, is that even if we produced a ton of work and it was all highly relevant, I think there is still this issue of how the evidence will be used in a political system and in a multiplayer setting like you were alluding to. And here I have a great quote from Alan Blinder, who's thought about this. He says economists have the least influence on policy where they know the most and are the most agreed. And they have the most influence on policy where they know the least and disagree most vehemently. And then he offers a somewhat sobering corollary where he says, when conflicting economic advice is offered, only the worst will be taken. So I think we do need to also have conversations about how our evidence in the end will be used, but we have much less control over that piece, which is why I was focusing my earlier remarks more on the things that we have control over. But Scott, you should probably directly say something on the RCTs.
Yeah, and I'll just offer a comment, just a kind of an anecdote that on the social welfare versus investor welfare, when the Jobs Act was passed, the irony is that it was not within the mandate of our economic analysis to measure the impact on jobs. In fact, it was just the opposite. We could only weigh in on investor impact. And along those lines, things that we don't include in economic analysis is the impact on the law profession or the accounting profession. You can imagine Sarbanes-Oxley generated a boon to the accounting profession in terms of revenue generation, but that is not a benefit, at least from an economic analysis perspective. But it is an open question on the objective function of the SEC, and I think Rob answered that pretty well. I think he also, what he said that really resonated with me is that at the end of the day, he just wants his fellow commissioners to be honest in why they're making the decisions they're making. If it's not based on evidence, then just say so. And I think as academics, that's our objective function too, is to provide the best information possible for decisions to be made. And if in a political system, they make decisions privileged on other information, that's fine, but you guys did your job in providing the information set for a good decision to be made. On the randomized control trial, question or randomized experiment, I think it's fascinating right now, at this very moment, that the Reg Show follow-up, which is called a transaction fee pilot, was another randomized experiment that was proposed by the SEC to look at order routing and understand, this is the Flash Boys, Michael Lewis book, is there nefarious behavior or is there inefficiencies by paying for a transaction flow? And this randomized experiment was set up to put bounds on how much could be paid for order flow to see whether or not there was an impact on the efficiency and investor welfare related to those transactions. The exchange is sued, and there's currently a stay on this particular rule, meaning that it's not going to happen until the legal issues are settled. And the exchange is sued, and they reportedly have hired the attorney related to a former Supreme Court justice who was the one who has taken down and beaten the SEC in previous lawsuits to represent them in this lawsuit. And I think it's a watershed moment. I'm kind of happy that this is happening because the issue, if you look at the general counsel at the SEC, has always said we can't experiment with public companies, it just wouldn't be fair. But in fact, we've had this little sliver of room where we could, with exchanges and trading, because we didn't think the impacts would be perhaps as profound on registrants, right? It's just the exchanges. So this lawsuit could be a watershed moment in the sense that if the SEC wins, it could be a moment to say we should be expanding it further into other areas. The cost is if they lose, it could end altogether the ability to do randomized experiments. But I do think that aspirationally, we should be moving in this direction. We should be doing more of it. It should be companies A through M get this treatment and N through Z get a different treatment, with a caveat that unlike in medicine where you can pick your samples out of millions of people, there's only a limited number of public companies, there's only a limited time series that gets measured quarterly, and you can't run too many experiments at the same time because you have confounding effects. So there's certainly limitations to this, but I think it is something that we should be pushing forward and convincing regulators and politicians that this is something that we should be doing.
Just want to add one quick comment, connect something with what Ed was saying yesterday. What I don't understand about the argument, and I understand it's going to be a legal decision and not necessarily an economic one, but as Ed was eloquently saying yesterday, they are already experimenting to some extent with companies when they're making rules and imposing them. Now, there's of course a due process, but I also think often we hear, and Rob mentioned that too, how that there's the cost arguments are constantly being made. And if it is true that regulation is so costly and has that many unintended consequences and is having various bad effects, then the more need we have to figure out how we could do it better. And in a way, these experiments are a way to do that. I want to put one caution on this, and that gets back to Bjorn's question as well, is experiments will be great for some things, but they're not good for everything, right? So for instance, general equilibrium type issues, we will not be able to address with an experiment by sort of nature if you do a small pilot. Long run effects are hard to see, and oftentimes in accounting we think there's important information spillovers. That's something that it's hard to get with experiments because you need to have a certain size in order to see the spillover onto other companies, and then you need perhaps the response of these other companies to it before you can really see how this is going to play out. So, I think pilots are important and experiments, and I'd love to see more of it, but I don't think in the end it's going to be the answer to all the questions, in the same way it's not the answer to all the questions in other fields either.
I'd like to go back to Scott. You proposed a vision that sounded to me like primarily one of intermediation between the decision makers and the academics, and getting the information to go both ways. And one of the things that I heard several people asking yesterday when everyone talked about translation is, whose job is that? Is that something the journals should be doing, that the authors should be, publishing in whatever CPA journal or the trade journals, or is that something that should be handed off to the people who are ultimately using it? And so it sounds like this, there's a need for some intermediary. And my question to you is, I was a little unclear when you started talking about that. You mentioned a few visions or organizational structures, and I wasn't sure if you have settled on the 501c3 type. And I also just wanted to share my experience trying to do that, because I worked with FASB for, I think it was like 5 years, that we were running conferences and getting academics to talk with staff and staff to talk with academics, paid for primarily by FASB. And that's a tough model because, regulatory organizations have their own interests and concerns, and it can be constraining. If we were to move it to the university, then we have the separate problem. It was a real challenge. And I guess so if you could just share a little bit more of your vision, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so I'm not doing a 501c3, and I'm not going to like a Brookings or an AEI, and those were models that I considered early on. The problem is the startup cost of doing something like that is so immense, and the infrastructure and academic institution is already in place. And academic institutions, charge overheads too. I know how much that is now. I've learned a whole lot. But just, go into a school that, like University of Texas, that has such a broad faculty and a rich environment, people that can contribute to this, and a big alumni network and a fair bit of money. This allows the program like this to start faster. To the extent it's going to be successful, I think that's going to help a lot. I think you're right in noticing that everything I proposed is mostly intermediation. I think my goals are somewhat modest in that I just want to pick the lowest hanging fruit. I do think there's a translation issue. And I think a lot of progress can be made just through awareness and helping. I think Mary, made the comment about breaking down the code that academics speak and auditors speak, and I think everybody has their own code, and trying to break down that code and help that intermediation process. I spent 12 years at the SEC doing just that, and so figuring out a way to expand that and allow others to do this In fact, if I were successful in 3 years, I could probably just quit and then don't have to do this anymore, and everybody else could carry it on. But that's right. That's what I have envisioned now, with the caveat that talk a little bit about Christian to this, and he alluded to it. I do have ideas about trying to make data available to academics. That's not currently available. I spent probably 7 years at the SEC trying to break loose SEC proprietary data to academics in a very limited way. Was successful. The log files was probably the biggest success. That was also probably an accident, more than it was brilliance on my part. But I do have a lot of knowledge in negotiating with financial services companies in particular and their general counsels on writing NDAs and so forth. And I think a lot of financial services companies would like to work with academics, but are afraid to do so because of not understanding the reputation or whether they would abide by NDAs and so forth. To create an infrastructure to allow that to occur, I think it's something that could be done. I know Chicago and other institutions have done something like this already. So maybe just raising the profile of some of the other ones may be the solution too.
Just for Scott, is any of your mission for intermediation with the next generation, like teaching students who are going to become the future standard setters and regulators, like sort of how does that fit into your mission or what you're hoping to accomplish?
Well, I hope ultimately I'll be a feeder to PhD programs, because I intend to solicit the help of a lot of students, undergraduate and graduates, to do a lot of the labor to make this happen, and maybe also help them get engaged and interested and wanting to go and do the research themselves. UT is very Austin-centric, and a component of my responsibilities, which I did not describe, is going to be in servicing the academic community there and the students, and so I need to find a way to do that as well. So my answer is yes. It's almost a rhetorical question. I would also like to work heavily with doctoral students, because I do know that one of the biggest challenges with doctoral students is to come up with a research idea. I think the best way to get academics involved in policy is to give them research that comes from open policy issues, and then down the road, if they're successful in those research agendas, they'll be more better positioned to weigh in the ways that I think would be productive.
You a follow-up question, which is, to what extent do you think there needs to be an education effort also towards the policymakers, standard setters, and regulators to some extent? And so, because there is perhaps sort of a translation issue, and maybe we need to just get everything so that it's plain English and anybody can understand it. But I sometimes have wondered whether we should actually even have should make a deliberate effort in engaging, and educating sounds a little bit perhaps too arrogant, and that's not what I mean, but in a way, people often have legal background, they have a law background, or they have a background in a different field other than accounting or economics, or they may have a background in accounting rules, but not necessarily, or as an auditor, but they don't necessarily have the background from the research side, is whether we could do more on that. And one place where we've tried to do this is we have a program at Chicago where we're bringing in journalists, and we're having them sit through courses and engage with us for a couple weeks, and then they go back to their journals, and it's sort of a way to engage with them. And I think I've often learned from these engagements, but it's also for them often very useful to sort of see how we work and how we should interpret our work.
Yeah, I think that's right on. And I'll say within the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, the secret weapon that we had in that division for being effective at the agency were the attorneys that were in the division. All of them were well trained in the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, and how to enact regulation and write rules. but they were also trained in economics or spent enough time working with economists they could serve that translation function in making the economists more effective. And in briefing the commissioners like Commissioner Jackson and Commissioner Peirce, of the 150 staff in DERA, about 10 of them were superb at doing the briefings because they just had a particular skill set and could speak different languages, multilingual, and would speak to attorneys on their terms. And I think ultimately, what you're alluding to, and if so, I think you're correct, is that academics have to speak on the terms of those who are going to consume the information because they will not want to speak on academic terms. They don't want to, they make fun of two-handed economists when in fact that's the value that we bring to the table. But I think that's right. And journals is a great way to go. And in fact, this is a secret weapon of academics, is that if the Wall Street Journal writes a story, typically the SEC will pay attention to it because it brings it into the press. And one thing that I've done since leaving is work with certain journalists, the Wall Street Journal and Reuters and FT, to help them make their stories better. Some of you may also work with the press in your areas, and I'd say please continue doing that because the better you make their stories, the more credible they become and the more that they have to be addressed by regulators.
That's actually what I want to highlight, the importance of a journalist. Like the AE meeting, these journalists, tons of journalists go to the AE meeting and cover the conference. I don't know for our annual meeting, how many journalists show up and cover our meetings. So I think that's probably an important step to bridge the gap between academic and policymakers.
Yeah, so one of the ways that I've found a lot of joy in presenting my research is going in front of regulators or policymakers and doing that. And given my research interests, I've found myself presenting in front of a lot of bank regulators. And I like Commissioner Jackson's suggestion that we should all present in front of his staff at the SEC. But I think those sorts of opportunities to get in front of practitioners or those that have a lot of experience with the institutional details is very few and far between. And that might be a missing link in terms of getting like instantaneous feedback for the institutional knowledge of our own research undertakings, and as well as the relevance that we have in terms of helping inform policymakers or regulators on questions that they might not be thinking about but might be important. So I wanted to get your perspectives on the role of the journals or centers that you're trying to form in terms of trying to get us to present in front of those that ultimately make the decisions.
So let me ask a question, and maybe just a question to everybody. How many of you, if you were invited by the SEC or the Fed or the CFTC to give a paper next week, would be able to do it? Yeah, it was a struggle that I had at the SEC when we set up our seminar series, and I tried to break this barrier down. I kept saying for years, like, why are we inviting people to our seminar series? We should be inviting papers. And we should be inviting papers to come next week. If we see something come out on SSRN, and it's new and it's fresh, why don't we invite them out? And there was a perception at the SEC that all of you would need a semester to plan to come and visit us. And I think, you know, I spent a lot of effort trying to change that. I liked Rob, and it's true, he does invite people to come in and stop by. And every Monday afternoon, there's a brown bag series at the SEC. It's a drop-by series where if you want to present a paper in a 1 hour period of time, there's an open slot, you can. And all you need to do is email somebody at the SEC and ask. And whenever I get one, I would submit it to the staff and say, is there an audience for this paper? If there was an audience for this paper, we'd say, yes, come in. You know, sometimes people send a paper and there's no audience for it and say, well, there's no audience for it, we'll keep it in mind. But that is something that regulators, and I think the Fed is very good at this, much better than the SEC, because they're, I think, and maybe prudential regulators generally. But I think it's a good point. And I think the SEC is not as good as it could be in bringing people like you and others in to talk about their research.
So since you asked about journals, I think we, for instance, at JAR have had a conference on securities regulation, and we did have practitioners and securities regulators participate. At the time, I think Troy Paredes was at the conference. But I think it doesn't have to be the journalists. I think the CARE conference is a fantastic example of doing exactly that, right? So I think in a way maybe we need just more of that. In Shiva's paper, there was the proposal to sometimes have practitioners discuss papers. I think that's an idea we should experiment with, which is great. The other connection I wanted to make was something what Greg said was his takeaway from the panel with Bob and Shiva was that it's important for us, I think, to often have the communication and talk to either the practitioners or the regulators. And I just wanted to sort of share one example. I would say it's, of course, sometimes, especially for the younger researchers, might be harder to get somebody to respond or get the right person on the phone to have the conversation. But I would still say, in my experience, even when I was way more junior and earlier in this, is that generally speaking, companies, regulators are trying to be helpful. And I've learned tremendously from just calling up people and saying, I want to understand this a little better. I want to make sure that I got the facts right and that I understand the mechanism. And just to, again, connect that with the theme of causality. Very often, a critical thing in order to know that whatever we're researching is a causal one is that we understand the mechanism, that we understand why that. The practitioners and the regulators can often be super helpful with the specific mechanism. So the paper that I mentioned with Lucy and Hans earlier, one reason that came about is because we were doing a survey among regulators and then had some conversations. And then we discovered that there were systematic major enforcement shifts right around IFRS that had to do with some of the implementations of some of the directives. And that's how we found out, but we only found out because we were talking to people, and then we learned some institutional knowledge that we didn't quite understand or didn't know before. So I would say I'd encourage you to sort of, reach out. And if this is sometimes hard maybe for the junior faculty, ask your senior colleagues whether they can make introductions, can make connections. Many of us in the room actually have these connections, and I think we could be using them.
I think just to that point, I have forwarded or connected hundreds of people to SEC staff working in areas like in corporate finance, investment management, trade and markets when questions come in. And it is just that. A lot of them are just referred to somebody like Christian or somebody else says, hey, I've got a colleague that's trying to do this, and make the connection. So just try to find the right entry point. But the academics, those institutions, will absolutely help find a way to help you.
So this is to both Christian and Scott. I appreciate that you've both spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about the issues that we've been discussing here over the last day and a half. And rightly or wrongly, I'm going to take as evidence of the success of this conference that you both led off by saying that you've learned something through sitting through the conference the past couple of days. And I was hoping that you might be able to share what one or two examples specifically that you've learned from this conference and how that might or might not change the way that you think or what you do going forward.
Yeah, well, the one thing that I've noticed is that typically at the end of a conference, half the people are gone, or it thins out, and well, a third of the people are gone. Just the level of engagement, the number of questions that are asked, at least to me, points out that all of you care. One of the biggest criticisms of my proposed center or program last fall was that academics just won't be interested in making a difference, and I just don't think that is true. I think most academics just don't. The costs of engagement are so high, and that's why they don't. And so I believe that most people in this room, if given the opportunity to leverage their research into helping policy, would take it. And I include amongst those people the assistant professors who are told to keep their nose down and get your research out. But I do think there's opportunities for everybody in academics and even PhD students to be more involved. And so that, to me, is, I think, what I learned, at least within the accounting profession. I don't know that the same reception will exist in finance, but within accounting, it was very encouraging to see all the reactions and questions here.
So maybe two things that I'd say I've learned. So if I think about the arc of the conference and how it's unfolded, I think especially early on, I think I've learned that we still have a long, long way to go on this transmission issue that we've talked about quite a bit, and how far we're at times apart, and how we're sort of speaking potentially past each other. And that's sort of why I was making the pitch for being very deliberate about setting up this infrastructure, and why I'm excited about what Scott is trying to do in Texas. The other thing that I would say I've learned from the CARE discussion, but also sort of having had the JAR discussion last week, sort of just back to back, is I think we need much more of these type of discussions, because there's a lot we can learn from each other, and we actually on many of these issues see eye to eye, but we need to have these conversations. And I was struck by how thoughtful, and how much people had thought about these issues, but it only comes to light when we're sitting down in a room like this and we're having these conversations, we're taking the time. And oftentimes the way we do conferences is we're having a conference on, with papers, and then it's going to be very narrowly focused on these papers. What this conference afforded is to have these broader conversations, and I think we need to have those. And the reason I was mentioning the JAR conference is there we had the discussion over replication and re-examination and reproducibility of the research, and it created a massive debate that's, as Joanna was saying, spilled over in the breaks and so on. And I think we need to give more room to that, because otherwise I don't think it's happening. It's hard to do. It's a sort of joint action problem, and it's not happening. And so, again, kudos to you guys for making that happen.
So we've talked a lot about randomized experiments. So it turns out if we go to Scandinavia, they have an amazing set of data. And so I happened to be at Copenhagen Business School earlier this week, and two faculty there shared with me a working paper. And let me tell you what they do really quickly. They look at the individual determinants of the CEO that make earnings management more likely using normal measures. And just so that you know what they are, it's the time that the CEO had the first child relative to their peer. It's when they were first divorced, the number of partners with whom they have offspring, as they describe it, right? And so then they create a summary of what, I don't want to label it anything except life history index, because that sounds neutral, right? And it turns out that index can actually predict earnings management, right? Well, in this age that we're coming to, where we have lots of individual specific data, right? And they have thousands and thousands of observations, we will be able to find characteristics of individuals who are CEOs who are on the margin are more likely to do earnings management. The question is, are we comfortable using evidence-based research? It's not a random experiment when we're down to the individual characteristics where it could look as if we are biased, right? It could be as if the people are predetermined to do earnings management because of their characteristics. Should we use that information from cross-sectional pooled evidence to make decisions about who to investigate? Or are there limits to what we're comfortable with?
We are out of time.
So let me try to take a quick stab at this. So I've recently had some conversation with some of my colleagues in psychology about this. I think they would, for instance, there's an element where I would be uncomfortable with this. So let me start by saying that. But one thing that they would point out, and because JARS, for instance, we've published some papers that are about specific traits, and they've showed correlations with certain outcomes. And when you talk to them, the psychologists that is, they will emphasize that it's super important for something like that to be making it very clear that we're talking about associations, and then be clear that we need to understand the mechanism for these things before we can draw any stronger conclusions. Right? I don't think you can stop people from doing, and people have to make individual choices, what they're comfortable with and what they're not comfortable with, and I don't want to regulate that. But I think we have to be super careful when we do that type of research and how it gets interpreted, how we talk about it. And I think what has become clear to me from these discussions with the psychologist, how important it is to understand the mechanism for these things.